Hi and welcome, and thanks for tuning in to another watercolor demo. Today we're painting a scene from downtown Stockholm. We're looking at the bridge here called Norrbro, and behind it to the left is the Swedish Parliament building. And what I like about this scene is it's got some nice structures and buildings in them, and they are backlit, so we have the sun coming from behind them. So they are seen as quite dramatic silhouettes towards this sky, which is also quite dramatic with these dark and fluffy clouds. Now, one thing here to notice is that this reference photo is taken with an iPhone camera, and those darn cameras are getting almost too good for our own best when we use them for these purposes. So those cameras were able to capture pictures in high definition range, and that means that where you would get very strong shapes and contrast with an old camera, these new modern cameras will capture details even where they are in the shade and when they are backlit and so on. And this means that when we use reference photos like these, it's quite important that we have taken the reference photos ourselves and we have seen the scenes with our own eyes. Because when I took this reference photo, I remember that there was a very strong light from the sun coming towards us and reflecting in the lower left part of the water here. So the water is rushing by real violently, and it's foaming, and it's almost, in real life, it was bright white, and you had to squint your eyes to look into it. That's not coming across at all in this reference photo. So this is, again, this is a good reason to work from your own reference photos and work from memory, and using the photo just to aid the process. So this is going to be the main story of this picture, I think, that bright sunlight reflecting off the water, and we're going to be working towards that as our objective sort of when we paint here, which means that we'll have to be mindful about contrast and values. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot to change around in this scene. I think it's a nice composition, that is. I don't have to move things around or remove things, so we can focus on the values and the contrasts to capture that light that we really want to bring out. And as we're done with our drawing, we can start mixing up some paint here, and I'm going to start working on the sky in the background. And again, if we want that lower left part of the water to look really bright and lively, we'll need to consider this as we put in our sky here, because in the reference photo there seems to be quite a few really bright spots as well in the sky, but this is not how we can do it. We have to make sure that the brightest parts of the sky are still darker than that reflective part of the foaming water to the lower left. So you can see me going in here with what looks like a fairly dark first wash. And this is the wash that you're going to see in between the clouds. So this is actually the lightest parts of the sky that I'm putting in here. And I'm making it gradually warmer towards the horizon. And this is something you can observe when you look at when you look into the light, when the sun is ahead of you, that the atmosphere and the clouds in the distance towards the horizon, they assume a warmer hue. And I'm using this broad flat brush here to just put in these major areas of paint, and also it makes it quite easy to preserve this sharp edge down towards the upper part of the bridge. And I'm preserving that for one reason, is that I want to be able to work on the sky and the bridge sort of independently, and also I want to leave some bright white edges and highlights on top of that bridge. So again, you can see that this flat synthetic brush is quite useful for that. Still working on the first wash, the lightest wash, so fair amount of water in the mix here. Just varying my hues a little bit, moving from essentially brownish to bluish hues as I put this in. And letting the water do its thing, letting it run and mix and bleed. Just preserving some lighter areas towards the middle part here where the bridge meets the water. We'll have some foaming water around the base part of the bridge. And I will I want to preserve that and also be able to work on the rest of the water independently later. So here I even put in some red to really vary the hue of that first wash towards the left. And just taking out some excess water, taking out the bead essentially here. Moving on to the water itself. And this is still just the first pass, so I'll just put in the sort of lighter hues of the water surface, and we'll go over it later with a few darker passes. And I'm planning to make the water really bright to the lower left, but the right side of the water surface will be slightly darker and not gather as much attention, hopefully. I'm putting in some warmer yellowish tones here, because you often see that when water is rushing by really violently and it's foaming, you'll usually have that sort of yellowish greenish hue of the water, just between where it's white and foamy and where it's dark and more calm. Moving on to the clouds now. And for that, first I'm wetting the paper surface a little bit to ensure that I can work wet in wet still. It's been a while since I put that base coat there, so I want to re-wet things a little bit. And then I'm mixing up a fairly strong, cold, bluish, grayish mixture paint here. Wetting things even more because we want fairly soft edges here. And start putting in the clouds. And when I do this, I try to be mindful that I preserve the edges around the clouds. So these clouds are backlit, so they're very dark, but they are backlit, so there will be some bright edges around the edges of the clouds. And if you don't think about this, it's very easy to put in too many brush strokes, and in the end you have left none of those sort of bright spots in between the clouds. Again, varying my hues a little bit, putting in some warmer hues here to the right, where the clouds are a little bit thinner and not as opaque. Also going more blue towards the horizon, so I'm adding more cobalt blue here to my brush. And ideally I want the clouds to really be part of the subject and help with the composition. So for one, I want to indicate some kind of S-shaped pattern in the clouds as they disappear towards the horizon. And I also want to think about the hues and the values to indicate that there's a sense of depth and a sense of atmosphere, and that those clouds towards the middle of the painting are actually a lot further away. And this is also helped by the fact that I use those warmer hues in the base paint and the first wash towards the horizon. Next up here, I'm just putting in some warm orangey hues over those buildings on the opposite side of the Parliament. That's a very common color to find in buildings in Stockholm. It's quite nice. And with more of that rich, dark, bluish gray in my brush, I'm going back into the clouds. I'm painting very wet in wet here, and when you do that, your values will fade a lot as the paint dries and the paper dries. So you need to almost exaggerate here and make things darker than it appears that they should be, because if you think you're getting the values right at this point, they will for sure be too light when the paper has dried up. Bit of a different strategy for me than usual here. I'm putting in the major shapes for the Parliament building and the bridge here also wet in wet as a first pass. I figured it'd be nice to have sort of the basic shapes put in wet in wet with some soft edges. Feels like it adds some drama to the scene. And I can go in later and sort of firm up the shapes and add a little bit more detail and yeah, just make the shapes a little bit more crisp where I want to. So I would say this is something I would do in some paintings, but not in every one. I varied my technique here quite a bit. And again, trying to paint around and preserve that sharper, brighter edge of the on top of the bridge. Putting in some dark paint here also for the area in front of the Parliament building. And in this area there are some trees and a statue and some other things that we'll paint in, but they're darker than the background here, so I'm just painting over those at this point. What I'm leaving out is this sort of horizontal area in front of the bridge here that I'm painting around, sort of a sliver of light there just to indicate that there's a horizontal surface there. Moving on to the bridge, trying to vary my use, going a little bit colder as of now, preserving that white edge and some of the details on the upper half of the bridge. Trying to strike a balance between being sufficiently careful that I don't paint over something that I shouldn't, but also not slowing down too much and becoming immersed in detail. And at this point, basically all of that bridge is going to have more or less the same value. I will come in later and put in a second wash with some more detail and texture. But as I reference my reference photo and sort of squint my eyes, I can see that essentially in terms of the major shapes, that bridge is just one big thing that's got the same, more or less the same value, and anything going on in terms of detail is just slight variations on top of that I can put in later. And there's some cars and people and lighting poles and stuff on top of Norrbro here, so I'm just trying to indicate and suggest that there's stuff going on top of the bridge, but not really aiming to paint any of that in detail. So while the wash is still wet, I'm going in with yet another few brush strokes here in the clouds to ensure that they are dark enough. Using my cloth liberally here to lift out paint and water in some places where I want to. And now I start working on some of the buildings on the opposite shore here of the Parliament building, and you can see now the paper has dried up. You didn't see that, but I edited out the part when I took out the hairdryer and dried things up. So we're now painting wet on dry, allowing us to make some some harder edges, and just trying to indicate that there are buildings with chimneys and other things on top of them, and not trying to place windows where they should be or anything, just some dots and pieces to indicate that there's stuff going on there. And here I'm just very carefully putting in some of the things that are on this area in front of the Parliament building, using a slightly darker but still quite transparent wash for those. And I need to be mindful here that I don't create too much contrast towards the main base value of the shapes in the background, because that will I think it will mess a little bit with the design. It will attract attention where I don't want it, and it will also detract from the sense of contrast and light. So there should be just some very faint suggestions of shapes and things going on there without them really inviting your eyes and brain to investigate and start thinking about that part of the painting. The important part of this painting is the bridge itself. It's the foaming water catching that bright sunlight coming in towards us, and those are the parts we should emphasize with contrast and strong values and occasional little details. So these are my attempts at these details I mentioned, putting in some blobs, some dots and lines on the bridge here, just making it look a little bit more like an old stone bridge, but not at all trying to paint every stone, every decoration or anything. Just strengthening the message here that you're looking at an old bridge. And again here, I'm using a fairly light wash with a lot of water in it. These details should be fairly transparent and just barely noticeable. I don't want to detract from the sense of contrast and backlight that we have achieved with these initial washes. I am allowing myself to go slightly darker for the underside of the bridge here, and just doing that with to emphasize the shape essentially of the bridge, but also to be able to sort of connect that to the fairly strong shadow that is beneath the bridge here. And that shadow I think is quite an attractive feature that I want to capture here. And it also helps bring out the contrast and the light of the water that's below it. Essentially, I think those very strong shadows beneath the bridge, they tell us that we have, although it's a cloudy day, the sun is shining between the clouds now, and the scene we're looking at is hit with some very, very strong bright sunlight. Essentially doing the same things to the Parliament building here that I did to the bridge, just adding some transparent lines and dots to indicate a 19th century building. Trying not to put in too many of those sharp and heavy lines, and we want to preserve that nice those nice soft edges we established in the first wash here. Now I'm mixing up some extremely heavy paint here, using French ultramarine, cobalt blue, some red, some brown. And I'm putting in this part of the water here that's, as the water is quite turbulent and foaming at some places, is quite calm in some other places, or at least it's more transparent, and where it's more transparent, it gets very dark. And I'm trying to capture this contrast between the calm, dark water and the sort of violent foaming parts of the water with some really dry and calligraphic brush marks here. This is a lot of fun, but it also takes some discipline not to become too mindful of your brush strokes and start fiddling with them. So you have to work pretty fast there and then almost look away for a while and make sure you don't put in too many brush strokes or fiddle around. And then I'm moving over to the right side of the water here, where we have some darker values than on the left. Trying to keep things quite simple here and focus on sort of capturing a sense of energy and movement in the water, which I think is almost impossible if you work with a smaller brush and focus more on the detail. You need to work fast and intuitively here, and just have some faith in that the overall design of the painting is sound, and that you can get away with some pretty rough brushwork and leave a lot of the details and things to the imagination of the spectator. Just slightly connecting that second water wash to the bridge there, as there are some very faint but still noticeable reflections of the bridge in that rushing water. Some very simple and transparent detail work here on the background behind the bridge. Certainly nothing we want to focus on, but just adding a bit more life in the background there. Improving the sense of depth essentially, I think. Time for some final touches. Going in with a final brush here. There's some flagpoles and things on the bridge that I want to put in. We have been working with some rather big shapes and not a lot of detail so far, so it's nice just to have a few of these things, and they add to the composition quite nicely to have those vertical lines coming out of those more sort of horizontal larger shapes. And they also add to the sense of depth, I think, that you have sort of the flagpoles and the flags in the foreground, which pushes the clouds more towards the background and the distance. And final part, always the most fun part, is to go in with the opaque whites, and in this case it's not white, it's a light yellow. But it's essentially use it as a white, it's just a slightly warmer version of white. Using that to put in some flagpoles that appear as lighter towards the dark Parliament building here. Also taking the opportunity to add a few dots and bits and pieces to the edges of those structures that are in the foreground. Some cars, the tops of some cars parked on the bridge here, and some just minor details. And that's about it. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel, and see you in the next one.